Hello.
You're listening to The Beautiful Idea,
a podcast from a collective of several anarchist and autonomous media producers scattered around the world.
We're bringing you interviews and stories from the front lines of autonomous social movements and struggles, as well as original commentary and analysis.
Follow us on Mastodon and at thebeautifulidea.show.
Thanks for listening.
All right, welcome to The Beautiful Idea. We're coming to you today after, a bit of a slowdown in our project. I think us, like a lot of you all out there, have been trying to make sense of what's going on, trying to figure out how much we need to be concerned with the things that are happening, sort of figuring out how to realign ourselves to the current moment, right? Or how much we even need to do so. And these are all really important questions, right? There's a tendency in like anarchist and autonomous circles to always want to push forward. But I know myself and a lot of us around this project and a lot of people we talk to have, I think, rightly been in a mode of sort of trying to read the situation a little bit. I know that I've been doing this for a really long time, and the level of trepidation I feel amongst the people I talk to, and I don't know if this matches the reality of the situation. I think that's a very different question that I want to talk about in a second, but the level of trepidation that I feel out there is very similar to what we experienced sort of after the Patriot Act got signed, or I know in the circles I ran in, we experienced this kind of fear around the Green Scare, and we experienced this kind of fear around the infiltration campaigns that happened in the 2005 through 2010 era. I know a lot of us have experienced this kind of trepidation on a local level, especially dealing with campaigns against the police. I know I have where I live, right? And I know a lot of you have too. So it's really important for us in moments like this, I found, to take a beat and just sort of figure out what's going on. And so that's part of the discussion that I want to have tonight, right? Like, we're at a particularly fraught moment right now that we haven't slid into full fascism, right? That what's happened isn't that definitive. But we find ourselves in some ways at sort of a more dangerous moment. We find ourselves at a moment in which a state is trying to rise to a position of primacy, but that doesn't have the resources or support or understanding to really do so. And so it sort of puts us into this position where we're sort of stuck in a bind. On one hand, we're dealing with an adversary that is devoted to consolidating power, that they're not interested in the normal means of sort of liberal discourse, right? And then on the other hand, we're faced with this kind of social movement politics, which has really been on the rise for the last 3 or 4 years, which is kind of this revival of the liberal anti-war movement, this sort of attempt to engage in a discourse of conscience with power and trying to get them to change their position because of political support. And we're stuck between this sort of attempts at authoritarianism that I think a lot of us understand can't be ultimately successful in the terms that they want it to be, and social movements which are incapable of opposing it, right? It's a really difficult time. And so what we have to look at in this situation is we have to look at how the terms of conflict have really changed, right? That, liberal democracy, as we understand it, is grounded in an attempt to contain conflict. It's not trying to eliminate conflict. That what's happening is within liberal democratic structures, the state claims itself as the mechanism through which all conflict gets resolved. So if you have a political demand, you frame it in a policy, you run an electoral campaign, you get someone elected, that person makes the thing happen, so on, right? Like that's the mythology. And that relies on sort of two groups of people to always play along. First, you need the people that are governed to play along, that they have to be okay with the idea that the state is the context in which all conflict plays itself out. That they have to be okay with the reality that if that context gets threatened, that, the tear gas of the liberal democratic state smells and tastes, and interestingly enough, is often made in the same factory in Pennsylvania as the tear gas of dictators, right? But on the other hand, the people that work within the state also have to have an interest in keeping that structure intact. What we're watching right now is we're watching a situation in which the state itself doesn't have an interest in that staying intact. But the social movements that are organizing a lot of the demonstrations exist within a context in which that's the only realm of appeal, right? We've entered a different place. We've entered a sort of state of exception, right? We've started to enter into a situation in which the norms that we thought had existed don't, in which the limits that we thought had existed don't, and in which the terms in which politics occurs have fundamentally shifted. And so what we're facing right now is a time that in a lot of ways is sort of this scary intermediary, right? It's sort of the moment that's dangerous and filled with hazard, that we're facing a state that is trying to consolidate power, but in the absence of being able to do so is flailing, is lashing out, is creating conditions in which confrontations become a lot more likely, right? And so we're entering increasingly into a situation in which all of these niceties of the liberal state, all of these things like free speech rights and the ability to have protests to, leverage your grievances against the political system and, all of these things, those niceties are going away. All of those things that all of our political categories rely on so we can make sense of the actions that we're taking are going away. And we're starting to enter into a phase in which a lot of our relationships with the state are going to become incredibly material, right, and conflictual, right? And so with that, we want to have a conversation about operational theory, right? We want to discuss sort of a project that is in the offing, that is coming this winter. We want to discuss what operational theory is, like why anarchists should be focused on thinking through things like how states function, right? How military operations occur, how military operations fail, right? As opposed to the sort of simplistic categories that are often used to talk about strategy and tactics within radical circles. So without further ado, after scaring the crap out of everyone, I want to introduce an editor of Breach Digest. If you want to just jump in, introduce yourself, and maybe talk a little bit about the project.
Hi, I'm an editor of Breach Digest. I guess for these intents and purposes, I'll go by Swarm. And yeah, Breach is in part, it's a digest, so it's sort of trying to demystify geopolitics and military theory and like just the inner workings of the military. I think that's like a thing that could be very helpful, but then also pull from it some of these maybe like strategic and tactical tools, and especially like having something that is like sort of a bridge between strategy and tactics and like figuring out like what that looks like and understanding, communication without like conventional command structures and proliferation of mission objectives without, conventional command structures and stuff like that they've been grappling with. And I think that a lot of movements in the contemporary grapple with as well. And also just not saying that we have like the right answer or the correct answer, but just giving people kind of tools and analysis so that when action happens, they can operate better within it. Yeah. And I also, a lot of things that you were saying about kind of our moment where we're in a moment where the state has abandoned soft power. Things are going to get more kinetic, but we also have to think kind of bigger picture and like think about when the pendulum swings back to, positive power, soft power in the imperial core. Like what position do we want to be in when that happens, and how do we operate, even like that far ahead, and like what we can do now to like make ourselves have a better position when that happens, while also taking care of like the kind of urgent things. Like in Go, there's this saying like urgent moves first, then big moves, and I think a lot of us are feeling that. And anyway, I guess that maybe suffices.
So let's start with the current state of discourse around action, right? So I remember a time when, those of us that were kind of locked in more consistent kinetic situations with the state were studying those things. We're sort of really trying to figure out what the limits of street action were. We're really trying to figure out what happened after that. And there seems to have been this lapse. And I'm not sure entirely why, but there seems to have been a switch in which most of the conversations that I now hear are based in trying to answer absurd questions like, how do we defend the, quote, revolution against the, quote, bourgeoisie, right? Questions that are so laden with assumptions and categories as to only allow for a specific limited series of answers. Questions which are ideology and not actually strategy, right? So where are we? Like, where do you see that discussion now? And how do you see us being able to move into a mode in which we're talking about these things in a significantly more nuanced way?
I think in the contemporary, we're kind of at a moment where people are looking at a lot of the impasses of like past struggles that they've been in, and maybe kind of treating history as like maybe overly pedagogical of like, oh, we must have done something wrong to lose, and also thinking in kind of like harsh terms of winning and losing, like not necessarily seeing the kind of dispositional or like social terrain that has shifted and being like, oh yeah, 2020 was a failure, and just kind of thinking like that. And like the classic solution is like, oh, it was a failure because we lacked, whatever like specific kind of organization people are advocating for, whether it's like decentralized, armed struggle cells that are clandestine or whatever, or, like a central committee, or like we need cadre organizing or something like this. Oftentimes it's kind of these like simple, like one-stop shop solutions. And a lot of people are either advocating that or, just staying out of the fray entirely. And oftentimes I think it's like lacking in this sort of like just trying to figure out what the hell is going on kind of thing that I think needs to happen first. And a kind of really humble way of like, if we didn't get close, which is probably maybe true to in terms of like social revolution, why, and like, how can we adjust ourselves, to be brave in the next, upheaval, or even just like what is missing in terms of our like critical acumen that we can like spread, and I don't know, in a way that can like sort of shift the sort of more ecological equation of like social movements and stuff like this, of not being like we have the one right answer, but how can we operate better within the social terrain that exists now, and what is the social terrain, as opposed to these kind of like almost like preconceived answer of like, this is the correct solution because this is like what my ideology tells me is the correct solution. Anyway, I kind of feel like that is oftentimes what people are going for, is like, oh, because I'm of this ideology, I have to like put forth this exact kind of like strategy, and that's what's working. And in like without any sort of like imminent analysis of their social terrain, either locally or nationally.
What I find super ironic about that, what I've always found kind of ironic about that, is it flies in the face entirely of where thought in the actual military is. That what we've actually watched happen since, we were talking before we started recording about Vietnam, but what we have really started, what we've seen happen since Vietnam is we've seen, to use the sort of generic historical framing, two schools of thought have broken off since Vietnam. One is the revolution in military affairs and the other is counterinsurgency, blah, 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 right? But essentially what that means is there has been a push to try and solve the problems that emerged during the war in Vietnam through technology. And there's been a push to solve the questions that emerged from losing in Vietnam through doctrine, right? And through specifically decentralizing understanding and doctrine. So what we've seen emerge in, the last decade is actually, interestingly, this kind of convergence point, right? So in modern military thought, the thing that we're seeing is this sort of moment in which the technology has allowed for the decentralization to occur, right? But there's always this kind of limit in the sense that they're trying to maintain force cohesion, right? So this is where modern military thought is. When we think about where radical strategic thought is in comparison to that, I think there's a problem of a body of assumptions that we're sort of operating from. And I think the question that we have to ask ourselves, right, or the question that I'm going to ask you is, how does operational theory help us solve for that, right? How does it get us out of this mindset of trying to abstract everything into simple conclusions, or get us out of a mindset in which we feel like we always have to have answers that are absolute, right, or total? Like, what does operational theory give us as a lens when we're dealing with, such a wild divergence in the level of complexity that goes into strategic thought between us and our adversaries a lot of the time?
That's a really good question. I think there's so many, it could mean a lot of things when we say operational theory. What are we talking about? I think in line with previous generations of revolutions, they were the revolutionaries that were participating that actually did read all of the military theorists like Mao and Lenin, and all these people were very familiar with a lot of the strategic and tactical analysis that sort of came about after the Napoleonic era and the invention of the mass army. So there's this kind of even just huge historical understanding, and we're getting kind of a lot of our strategic information third hand almost, in a really watered down way. And I don't necessarily think we always need to consult, grand histories or the great men of history to figure out what's going on. But, looking to our contemporaries is probably helpful, and kind of updating and seeing they're running into a lot of similar problems. But then in terms of just operational thinking in general, I think in terms of situational awareness, it's really helpful for both micro and macro situational awareness, in that, it can take John Boyd's OODA loop or something like this, where it's just what am I even doing in the street? Trying to have a sort of metacritical lens about what's happening. And, it gives us basically cognitive maps to look at the situation. And then we know these maps are imperfect, and it can give us sort of tools and heuristics for then challenging our assumptions of what is our mission? What are the methods and ways we're trying to accomplish it? And then I think to be very basic, it's just coherence between means and ends is this huge focus in operational theory. I think that is actually just also literally what most anarchists would say, that why they're anarchists is because they think there is some sort of connectivity between means and ends. And I think, that's maybe something that, that could be enhanced by, engaging in the operational arts.
So let's get into a little bit about what that means, right? So you and I are both people who have been engaged with that kind of discussion for a really long time. I know myself, right, just to give you all a little bit of background on my engagement with this. It started around, so this is going back to a time where I bet some of the people who are listening to this weren't even born, but 2005 in October, there was a big showdown between anarchists and a bunch of people in the neighborhood on one side, and the National Socialist Movement and the Toledo, Ohio police on the other side. And it turned into this wildly kinetic, neighborhood-wide, 3-day-long street riot that the National Guard got called out to, and all of this stuff. And you have to keep in mind, in 2005, things like that did not really happen. Right. We weren't in a moment in which there was acute conflict with the police. That the last time things like that had really occurred, there was Seattle in 99. There had been some confrontations around the anti-war movement. But really, the last time there had been a full-blown neighborhood uprising like that had been in Ohio. It had been 5 years before that. the Timothy Thomas riots. And there had been a small one in Benton Harbor a couple of years before that. But these weren't things that were really common at the time. And so for the first time in a while, we faced down military units in the streets and had to really figure out what was going on. We had come up through social movements in which direct action training largely comprised of a bunch of pacifists telling you to hold peace signs and walk towards a police line. So if they brutalized you, you'd get on camera. And so we had to figure out how to be able to stand in the streets against a modern police force, right? And we started with police crowd control manuals and started studying from there. Out of that came the, because we weren't the only group of people doing that. Like this was happening in other parts of the country. Out of those discussions came things like the shutdown of the RNC in St. Paul in 2008, or the G20 in 2009, these long tactical treatises about street tactics and all of these things that were written at the time, right? And that's sort of how we came into it, is we came into it trying to understand how the police functioned and what we could do as a small force on the street, holding on to our decentralized structures to be able to move faster than them, right? So yeah, I think maybe getting into like, what does studying operational theory mean? I mean, like in my context, it was studying police tactics manuals and moved into terrain analysis and moved into reading Clausewitz, Jomini, people like this. But what kinds of things are you looking at? What sorts of things are the people around you talking about? And for people listening, what kinds of things could they start skilling up in, looking into?
I mean, yeah, there's a lot of answers to this, obviously. I think John Boyd is a great place to start with a lot of this, in that he was kind of interested in what ways do blitz warfare, guerrilla warfare, and ancient warfare have these sort of, lessons and, doctrinal applications that can actually, give you an advantage against a force that has more people than you, that is better equipped than you, that is always going to be better militarily than you in a lot of ways. And also, I think we have to constantly remind ourselves we're not actually trying to militarize ourselves. This is maybe sounds like oxymoronic to a lot of people, but the power of an insurrection is still social. And the militarization of the insurrection is not what is necessary for it to be successful. It's in fact that it's the more you study operational theory in terms of, Boyd and, cybernetic warfare, unrestricted warfare, there's a bunch of texts from Rand that come to mind also. And so, some Chinese PLA writings, unrestricted warfare being one of them, that kind of just reveal that we are actually in a sort of state that where we can outmaneuver both literally and metaphorically the state, and the state and its militaries and its security apparatus are actually a lot slower than us. And even though they have no moral limits, they're willing to do terrible things, right? There's a sort of ontological limit that they have. This is sort of like the Matrix. The agents in the Matrix always have this limit, because they have to back up, a military hierarchy, because they're fighting to maintain order of a nation state, and because they're servants of the capitalist world order. They have these ontological limits that we don't have, that we can operate around, that that we can socially operate around, that sort of do give us certain advantages, and we're just not playing into them when we do, whether it's frontal clashes or things like this. And I think these sort of irregular engagements and this theorizing of are we actually accomplishing our goals? I think Petraeus is one of these people who really kind of failed in his actual operations, but when you look at what he failed at and how he tried to correct, you can kind of see that oh yeah, you actually constantly need to be learning in order to be effective. And how can we create even just simple rituals in our own lives and strategies, and have these sort of meetings where we're reflective of oh, what are we trying to accomplish? How do we get there? Are the methods we're using actually accomplishing them? And creating just kind of practical things. I think that's one of the things that at least in my circles, this is what we're talking about, wargaming and things like this. Because I mean, we did this before Trump was elected, in terms of what does Trump want to do? What does Project 2025 want to do? And in our area, we got together and sort of crafted this war game and played out the different roles. And so when Trump got into office and started doing these things, we had already prepared to kind of, build out rapid response networks and sort of talk to people about mutual aid and, respond in certain ways that we knew we kind of foresaw these things coming. And a lot of people had kind of the sort of situational awareness established that they weren't panicking as soon as the news broke. They had kind of like some at least foresight, and also knew that like, you know, we shouldn't also just act without thinking. I mean, that's like kind of rambling tangential, but hopefully that gave some answers to the question of like what we're thinking about, what we're doing. I think also like importantly to note, like operational theory, you know, when it really comes into full force, you know, in 1923 with Svechin's writing this, he's a Soviet general, he writes this piece called Strategia, where basically combat operations are not self-contained. And this idea of like kind of a holistic understanding of strategy and tactics that can get kind of nebulous and metaphysical and stuff like that. But like understanding that every little thing actually does like contribute to this sort of like social war that's unfolding and to like, you know, the insurrection that's unfolding, and kind of like integrating that into our sort of daily lives and stuff is also, I think, at least to me, is important. Yeah.
Yeah, so let's actually do a little bit of that, right? Like, let's actually do a little bit of threat modeling about the situation that we're facing right now.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things I was talking about at the intro is that we're kind of in this in-between space, right? Where, you know, okay, so anyone that's been on the street, that was on the streets in the late 2000s, has definitely faced down more than 200 National Guard people, mm-hmm. right? On a single street before. Like, it's a thing that we used to see a lot. So we know that that amount of National Guard troops can't control a city.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? We also know that, like, with even a bunch of ICE agents backing them up, they can't control a city. Right? And so what's happening is there feels to me like there's this kind of separation going on where the reaction to what is happening is sort of a reaction to the intent or the stated intent, and not so much a reaction to the reality that we're actually seeing on the ground, right? So I guess the question is, if we're going to recognize that, how do we actually see the reality on the ground, right? Like, what is going on here right now? Like, how are you reading this situation? And where do you think this is going, right? Because it doesn't feel like military occupation is a viable reality, but it also feels like there is an attempt to convince us that it is, right? Yeah. How do we parse those separations, right? And what are the things that you're kind of looking at right now as you're kind of trying to pick apart what's going on?
Okay, so I mean, I think one thing is obviously the generals are way smarter than Trump is in terms of a lot of this stuff, and then the way they, and you know, the feds and stuff apply this, not that they actually care about people's rights or anything like that, or like don't want to occupy places, but they know that there's ways to actually inflame a situation and not. So putting that out there, first of all, is why I think a lot of the time there isn't like really obvious like aesthetics of military occupation happening. But like in terms of what is actually happening, I think we'll take like Portland as an example. There's basically half of one side of a city block that is the like official battle space, and pretty much everybody involved is like accepted that as the official battle space. And of course, Trump can secure that. Of course, the BORTAC units like the Border Patrol Special Operation Group and all their buddies, and then perhaps 200 National Guard members can secure that. That's obvious. But if that battle space was exploded, if like the front lines were everywhere, right? Every single person that works for, ICE has, homes and all these logistics that they like exist in. And then also at the same time, all of the contractors, all of the vehicles, all these other things have like massive logistical things. And that's one of the things I think, just looking at terrain analysis and logistical analysis can help us with, is understanding that, like the front lines are in fact everywhere. Like power is logistical in so many ways, as much as it is also social. And one of the things that like Trump has been really good at is like limiting, at least in Portland, limiting the front lines to this one site that they can easily control. That being said, Chicago is more complicated, and that's, I think, why you can see Chicago popping off a little more, right? They're going into neighborhoods, people are hating them, and Trump has no soft power. So like the trajectory of that doesn't seem good for Trump, in my opinion, in terms of like everybody hating the feds, everybody kind of conflating the cops with feds, and every single like Fed is now kind of has a target on their back, especially since they've all been doing, been part of these like secret police ICE operations. Like drug busts have now been broken up by people kind of autonomously of their own volition, like kind of just like doing really low intensity tactics to disrupt them. And like that, I think, has a lot of potential. And that is something that people aren't necessarily even highlighting, although there's a strong push, I think socially to proliferate these tactics in a way that I haven't seen before. Like, thinking of like on last week tonight, they were like celebrating like Border Patrol, like tires getting slashed or something like this. Like there's a lot of popular support for these low intensity tactics, and they are spreading in a lot of places. And I don't know if there has been enough like sort of narrative work or like highlighting work to like kind of like show that these tactics are working or are actually the like solution, as opposed to like at least what they say in Portland is like not take the bait or whatever. But that being said, if you actually like look at what's going on in Portland, the other aspect of it is that the feds can't do raids anywhere else in the city, really. It's just not socially tenable. And this is like just kind of blowing it up even further. This like the DHS made after 2001, the Patriot Act and all these things have a lot of like more intense stuff they've never actually been able to pull off because it's not socially tenable. And I think Trump is trying to push the situation so a lot of this stuff becomes more socially tenable. And then, if we have a sort of like broad, like long trajectory, we can see that anything that Trump pushes now is like the point at which, the Dems in the future are going to ratchet back from. So it actually is important to like push back as hard as we can in certain ways in this moment so that, the new normal that's established either now, but also in the future is not as repressive as it could be. But suffice to say, yeah, I mean, we have, let's see, like National Guard that are like mustering in like 200 like soldier increments. We have feds that are like more and more and more networked, being pulled off of all of their cases pretty much to be this sort of new secret police kind of apparatus that is focused on like xenophobic targeting of people. And, we have a population that is like kind of primed to resist this, who sees this as bad, which is good. And I think a lot more than like in previous iterations, like maybe post 9/11, it didn't feel like this, right? So there is that. And I think also like low intensity stuff, coming off of the end of 2020 is like, pretty something that could be pretty popular as long as it maybe breaks out of the containers that Trump tries to put it in terms of like just targeting this one ICE building or, just like having a politics of like, look at us, we're not actually dangerous terrorists or whatever. Like trying to respond rhetorically in that way.
Yeah.
As much as I think that it's important to like do the we are all anti-fascist move and like have the sort of lowest common denominator of this being like the most tepid and reasonable position fucking possible to be anti-fascist, right? And like to not make Antifa a distinct category that can then be targeted as like, oh, obviously it's these people are the terrorists. They don't have a community. They're not like normal people. That's one way that marginalization works, right? Where it's like, if Antifa can be made distinct from the general population, then it can be targeted. So like, I guess part of the solution to that would be sort of proliferating these methods, right? That Trump is identifying as Antifa and making like, sort of the general population sort of take them up as they already have. And making is a weird word, but like just kind of helping proliferate them and highlighting that everybody is actually doing these things. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, well, and it leads to this really interesting dynamic a discussion around a really interesting dynamic I noticed going on now. We're 2.5, almost 3 weeks into a government shutdown. They're starting to mass fire government workers, right? Mm-hmm. They already have mass fired government workers. They've already created chaos inside of the bureaucracy. Something like 40% of the line attorneys of the Department of Justice have quit. The FBI and their entire incentive structure and the, prospect of ending your career at the national office, all of that's been disrupted. And at the same time that all of that's happening, it feels like they're trying to speed run all the administrative steps of authoritarianism. Mm-hmm. That there's this kind of sort of effect in which it feels like we're constantly accelerating towards something, but it's hard to see what, right? And that it's hard to see that this results in anything other than tragedy or collapse. But how do we read that, right? Because the dynamic feels really hard to understand, right? On one hand, we have this sense in which government operations are ramping up that they're ramping up in scale, that they're ramping up in intensity and force. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, the state itself is hollowing itself out, right? Sort of administratively and bureaucratically. How do we sort of read that? And how do we kind of pay attention to that? Like, what do we track to kind of keep an eye on that?
Yeah, so I would track, like, you know, if Trump says he's going to send the National Guard, like, actually just look at the troop movements and, like, understand, like, you know, from credible news sources, which troops are going where and how many, and that kind of sort of, like, undercuts, because he's made a lot of threats to send a lot of people a lot of places, but it doesn't really count until there's boots on the ground, and even then, it doesn't really count until they're actually deployed. So, like, Trump is going to do a lot of, you know, bravado to sound tough. That's like what he always does, and half of it's lying. You can pay attention to Trump, I think, in that he will signal what he's, like, thinking and who he talked to last, which could change. But with, like, you know, peace deal stuff or whatever, if he starts shit-talking Netanyahu, it probably means that Netanyahu's, like, dragging his feet on something, and it could easily flip, but just kind of know that as, like, a temperature check. But, you know, look at the actual, like, material, like, machinations of what's happening, and don't rely on, you know, the sort of, like, political narratives to tell you, one, what's happening, and two, like, how people are actually feeling about something. I think that even just, like, social media and a lot of things like this, like, if we're talking about, like, what to actually look at, is, like, you know, something like X or Instagram, whatever, like, produces this idea of, like, everything you're seeing on here is, like, what people in general are actually feeling, and in reality, it's not necessarily that. And I think that, like, actually going out and getting a temperature check on the ground is a lot more helpful in terms of, like, what people who are willing to leave their house or whatever are actually feeling. And again, yeah, like, actually paying attention to maybe what generals and, you know, lieutenant colonels are saying, and, you know, which task force are being assembled. Like, is it Task Force 51? Is there, like, a new task force that's been made by you know, the FBI, DEA, and stuff, and, like, what's that? What are there actual raids happening? What is, like, the actual, like, when the National Guard are deployed, what are they actually doing? Are they standing around, walking around? Do they have their guns out, like, and are assisting in arrests? Like, kind of looking for, like, the actual material implications, or, like, the actual, like, things that have happened versus, you know, sort of the vibrato. Because I mean, that's the whole point of Trump's whole thing, is maybe not even talking to us, but talking to his base of seeming strong. And that's, like, kind of all he kind of cares about, is, like, this sort of bravado. So to understand what's really happening, you can't listen to him or his sort of, like, liberal opposition, who are also playing this game of being the more reasonable, you know, wing of capital in the security state, who, you know, haven't really actually kicked ICE out of anywhere materially, who, like, assist ICE in a lot of ways, but, like, posture like they don't. I'm thinking specifically of Portland. Anyway, but yeah, so in terms of what to actually look for, like, look for verified stuff that has actually happened or is in the works of happening and stuff like that. There's not necessarily a lot you can telegraph from, like, the sort of political rhetoric, because, you know, if you did listen to Trump, you know, Portland would be on fire, right? And it's certainly just not the case, not even in, like, half a block. Anyway, yeah.
So if people want to start to study these things, I think maybe it'll help to give a bit of a reading list, or maybe a bit of a history, right? So, you know, you'd been mentioning, like, anarchists have been doing this kind of thinking, writing for a really long time. I mean, you can go back to the Paris Commune, right? And there's writing like this. I mean, there was really interesting writing about the Durruti column, but yeah, maybe get into some of the things that, you know, have inspired what you're working on, some of the thinkers that you've been kind of, like, working through, and some of the stuff that people can check out.
Well, we have an anthology out right now called Deceiving the Sky that has, you know, some of this stuff in it. This is part of why I also wanted to make Breach, is because there isn't just a lot of it accumulated in one place. But I certainly would recommend reading John Boyd and the anthology of John Boyd's, you know, Discourse in Winning and Losing, the Rand, you know, corporations, net war. Anything they're writing about net war is usually kind of in this line. Yeah, Sun Tzu, even just, like, very basic stuff like that. And it might seem, like, ridiculous to read someone who's talking about a general, but if you kind of just ignore that, and instead of, like, thinking about command, thinking about, like, how do we, like, have cohesion in our ranks, it's really like, did you think about the weather? Did you think about the terrain? A lot of, simple stuff like that. And yeah, what else? Yeah, I mean, there's like so many. I don't even know where to like start with this, but the FAO, the Anarchist Federation of Uruguay, has this critique of Foucaultism that's pretty good. That in terms of like, subordinating a military line to the social line is pretty good. That can pretty much be found by Googling FAU and a critique of Foucaultism. That's one of the pieces that I found really resonant, especially in the contemporary when we're dealing with a lot of like, anti-imperialisms that don't necessarily consider the social being, more important than sort of like specialization of like sort of military engagement. Yeah, I don't know. Obviously there's this piece on operational art by Milan Vigo. He wrote for like, I think the Croatian Military Academy. That is just, if you want just like kind of the straight history of what operational theory was from like, Antoine Henri de Jomini to like, the contemporary, and like when it got into, the American field manuals in the 80s after Vietnam, which is like, maybe that's another like telling thing, is that after Vietnam happened, the American generals were like, what the fuck just happened? And really started to deep dive into, what the Vietnamese Northern armies were thinking, and like discovered that, Operation Art pretty much there. It wasn't really in English language text until the 80s, until I can't remember what field manual it was, but until one of the field manuals there. Anyway, I know you probably have a lot of references in terms of like tactical stuff that like anarchists have written that you should probably list off if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, so there's, my classic, the one I always go to, the one I always focus on if we're doing reading groups, is Clausewitz's On War.
Yeah.
So one of the things that's really fascinating about that text, for those of you that are listening, is, and you touched on this a little bit at the beginning, after the French Revolution, there were two things that happened that fundamentally changed the way that wars were fought. And that really influenced in a lot of ways the ways that radicals think about conflict, especially in the kind of European framing. The first was we started having mass politics, right? So the French Revolution was, one of the first kind of modernist political revolutions that was motivated by a series of kind of overlapping ideologies that were against monarchism, that were all trying to build a specific kind of world, right? And out of that came this idea that you could have an army that was motivated to fight, that weren't mercenaries, that weren't pressed into service, that weren't aristocrats, but that were motivated to fight, that were motivated to like destroy monarchism or something. The second thing you had mass production. Yeah. And so you had mass production of rifles and you had mass production of ammunition. And what that meant is that soldiers now, by the tens of thousands, could do target practice and drill and do things that you couldn't really do to the same degree before, right? Those two things together fundamentally changed warfare. And what happened is all of these armies that had existed before this, which were based on mercenaries and aristocrats and professional soldiers who were small comparatively, very small. While like a French army might be 400,000 strong, they might go up against a foe that had 30 to 60,000 troops under arms, like much smaller, which then forced them to rely on a lot of conscripts, right, to kind of fill their ranks out. And so their structures of regimented movement broke down very, very quickly. But what Clausewitz recognized, and this is what's important about that work, it wasn't because they were outnumbered. That wasn't the thing that did it. Napoleonic warfare was actually based on disorganizing an enemy. And this is the important lesson from the work. So what Clausewitz understood was that Napoleonic warfare, though it did rely on numbers, also relied on things like really good intelligence gathering, sabotaging supply lines, having really good comms. So like the French had, I forget what they're officially called. I refer to them as flappy arm towers. They were like these very tall, like 4-story tall towers, and they had these like arms on them. And they could relay messages across the French countryside from the front in, 5 hours or something, as opposed to a rider on horse taking multiple days, right? And so they could communicate a lot faster, but they also used snipers. And they took out officers, which was, quote, ungentlemanly, right? But it also completely broke down the command structure of their opponents. And then they refused to ever stop pursuit. So, like, it was very common in warfare at the time to fight and then have an agreed upon rest period.
Yeah.
And Napoleonic forces were so numerous that they didn't need to rest. They could continue to pursue with different units while giving other units rest time. And those things combined broke apart the command structures of those militaries. It's not that they got annihilated. It's that they got disorganized.
Yeah.
Right? That is the central premise of all insurgency. It's also the central premise of all counterinsurgency. The text is incredibly long. If you're going to go get it, get the official US Military Academy version, which is unabridged. It's really huge. And it includes a really cool section on partisan warfare, which is fascinating and incredibly instructive. So I definitely think people should pick that up. But Carlos Marighella wrote the Mini Manual of the Urban Guerrilla in the late 50s, early 60s. That was a text that was incredibly influential on a lot of radicals in the 70s, a lot of people like me that came up through black blocs in the early 2000s. Abraham Guillen was a South American anarchist who really wrote a lot about the dynamics of small groups of people trying to fight against military states and how logistics became really important in those struggles. In the modern era, I worked on a journal called Insurgencies back in the day. We put out a couple of issues and a book full of stuff about analyzing conflict in Syria. There was a journal that came out around the same time called Hostis, which people should really pick up, which is if you can still find copies of it, I'm sure they're online on Anarchist Library. But Hostis was a really interesting journal because it departed from the notion that what we were doing was trying to study hostility, right? That we weren't interested in compromise or negotiation as a basic premise of everything we were doing, right? There also is a writer, I think from Canada, named Zigzag, who wrote some really incredible zines maybe about 8 or 10 years ago that I think people should really look up. They were amazing kind of on the street tactical analysis of different things that happened. And now there's a couple of projects that are starting to kind of dig into these things again, Breach being one of them. So yeah, I mean, there's a laundry list. There's a lot of stuff to read. Yeah.
I think, it's so funny whenever a record button hits, I feel like it takes me a while to hit my stride again. But just in terms of thinking about what are some key elements of operational theory, I would be remiss if I forgot to mention that, obviously you mentioned intelligence, you mentioned communication, and then I think there's this other thing, tempo, who's responding to who and who's in the head of who. That's something that John Boyd talks about a lot, of getting inside the other person's sort of response. And I think, that's something that people don't necessarily think about a lot, but when you're constantly reacting to the enemy and thinking about them, you're not taking a lot of proactive steps, and you're kind of you're constantly ceding territory to them. So doing proactive things is one of the most important aspects, I think, of, operational theory, and having good intelligence to kind of do that, having the correct information about what's going on, and having good information about your enemy and yourself, and knowing yourself, and that kind of thing. And then, in terms of communication, I think a lot of people think oh yeah, direct communication is what mostly people think about, signal or something like that. But there's also, so much indirect communication happening all the time that people kind of discount. I think even wheat pasting has gone away a lot, and the sort of work that wheat pasting can do has been sort of replaced by posts. And I don't think any sort of, this is just maybe me being a millennial or something like that, but I think that any wheat paste that you're going to do is probably going to be seen more than any social media post you're going to do, unless you belong to kind of a sort of minority of social media influencers or something like that. Like, you could put something in a key location that will be seen by like thousands of people before it gets taken down. And like putting that all over the city makes, people feel like it's kind of in the air. And yeah, anyway, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that kind of sort of like, indirect communication on mission objectives, trying to actually get the tempo and acting in a way that forces the authorities to respond to you as opposed to you responding to them, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's, right now, Trump is like kind of the regime of the censor. He is kind of responding to things and that actually puts him in a disadvantage. Like, a lot of people may not necessarily understand this, but like, it's actually like power exists in the proliferation of certain kinds of things, not necessarily in the censorship of them. Like control often works by sort of proliferating a very specific kind of thing. Like with capital, it's like you can do whatever you want as long as your like niche subculture, whatever is like contributing to capital or isn't going beyond the pale of like liberal discourse or whatever. And people are actually excited about it, whatever. But in the contemporary, it's like the regime is actually a regime of the censor, and we can kind of outmaneuver it on that front. Yeah, anyway.
Well, and I think the core lesson I always derive from operational theory is that, and this is the same kind of thing that you pull from, any of you that are like extreme philosophy nerds that really want to get into something like real wild, the Kyoto School writings from like the 40s to the 60s really emphasize this, but operational theory always brings me back to basics.
Yeah.
Right. That at moments when I feel as if we've lost our way, or I feel as if the political horizons that seem to have energy and momentum aren't particularly promising. One of the things that I'll do is I will try and strip away as much of the fluff and the extra considerations and things as I possibly can and get back to the basic idea that at the end of the day, what we're doing is we are fighting a state so we can have control over our lives.
Mm-hmm.
And that there's nothing more basic and material than that.
Yeah.
And what it does is it drives me back to my street, my neighborhood, right? It gets me to walk around more. It gets me to pay attention more. It gets me to focus on, what are the dynamics of the politics in the place that I live? Who's making calls, right? How is that an impediment to things I'm trying to do? What does that mean in the context of national politics, right? I try and focus on the things that are very immediate. Because one of the things about operational theory that is undeniable is that at the end of the day, it can never function ideologically.
Yeah.
That it always has to function as a constant analytic process of trying to figure out how to achieve an objective against an adversary.
Mm-hmm.
And those terms are very simple in a lot of ways. Right now, it feels like we need a heavy dose of that. It feels like we need to get back and focus on the basics again, right? Things like wheat pasting are really interesting because, there's this idea that another group of people that was interested in operational theory, the Situationist International, the idea of psychogeography.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? We don't transform our spaces in the ways that we used to because we don't inhabit our spaces in the ways that we used to. And one of the things that operational theory drives me back to is inhabiting my space. I always find that incredibly invaluable, especially at a time like this where the center of gravity, is 9 hours by car away from here, and it feels like that's sucking all of the oxygen out of the room.
Yeah.
But did you have anything else that you wanted to mention, talk about, anything like that?
There's so much. I think one of the ideas also is like thinking about if, what is the relationship between sort of like the movement of revolutionaries and the revolutionary movement, I think is like something to think about in terms if we are like kind of having this sort of more dispersed model, like understanding that can be pretty important in that also, that discursive interventions aren't actually going to change things necessarily. It's people are changed and created even through action. And people like where people are ideologically now is not where they're going to be ideologically after like a wave of action hits. Like I think a lot of anarchists, did come into anarchism through action. And I think if we're thinking about it on an operational level, like it is definitely good to create doctrine, like, maybe in a very loose sense. But at the same time, it's, sort of action in the terrain that dictate what people like are produced and what like the new kinds of people that come to the forefront. See, is there anything else? Well, there's this piece, Fragmentation, Centralization, and the Civil War, the Japanese ultra left that came out on Ill Will. That's, I think, a pretty good analysis of sort of like an operational almost analysis of what people were trying to do in Japan after the 60s and how it became sort of like insular and ended up like in this like hyper sectarian moment. And that's maybe something for us to look at now as more and more people are like taking on sort of sectarian forms. Anyway, yeah, I don't know. There's so much, but.
Well, cool. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of The Beautiful Idea. News and analysis from the front lines of anarchist and autonomous struggles everywhere. Catch you next time.